The notary kept the original, how Bernadette's certainty cost her everything at the Raleigh auction barn. The kitchen radio was playing a Statler Brothers song neither of us liked when my daughter Marguerite came in from the barn with hay in her braid and asked me to fix the button on her wedding jacket. It was the second Saturday in April, and I had the ironing board up in the corner of the farmhouse kitchen with the window cracked so the steam wouldn't fog the glass, and there was a plate of orange slices going warm on the counter because she never could remember to eat before a job. I threaded a needle without my readers, which I was proud of at 61, and I sewed the loose horn button back onto the wool while she stood there in her stocking feet telling me about the mare that had foaled 2 nights early. That is the picture I hold on to now, when I have to hold on to something. My daughter smelling of alfalfa and horse, the needle catching the morning light, the coffee going cold in the pot because we were both too busy talking to drink it. I did not know yet that the morning I would need to remember was still 14 months out, and that I would spend it standing in a doorway with my hands full of ruined tissue paper. I should tell you who I am first, because it matters to everything that came after. My name is Opal Norwood, and for 31 years I moved things for the United States Army. Not weapons mostly, and not soldiers, though I did my share of both. I moved the unglamorous freight that keeps an army from starving in place. Fuel bladders and generator parts, pallets of MREs, the 8,000 cots that had to reach a base in Bavaria before a single tired body did. I retired as a lieutenant colonel in logistics, which is a fancy way of saying I spent 3 decades learning that the whole world runs on paperwork nobody reads until it is too late. I learned to keep 2 copies of everything, and to date and initial the second copy, and to trust the record over the memory of any human being alive, including my own. When people tell me they remember exactly how something happened, I have learned to smile and go find the shipping manifest. My husband Wendell died the winter I turned 58, of a heart that simply stopped one Tuesday while he was refilling the bird feeder outside the mudroom window. We had 34 years together, and 140 acres of clay-heavy North Carolina land north of Raleigh, most of it in pasture, some of it in the loblolly pine his own grandfather had planted in 1941. Wendell was easy in a way I never quite managed to be. He whistled. He believed the best of people right up until they proved otherwise, and sometimes past that. And he loved his mother Bernadette with the uncomplicated devotion of a man who had never once in his life caught her in the act. I want to be fair to Bernadette because being unfair to her would let her off too easy. She was 82 years old when this began in earnest, a small, upright woman who wore her white hair in the same pin curls she had worn since Eisenhower, and who had run the County Baptist Women's Auxiliary for so long that 3 pastors had come and gone beneath her. She was not stupid, and she was not weak. What she was, and I did not understand this for a long time, was certain. Bernadette had decided at some point in the Truman administration that the world had a proper order to it, that land passed to blood, and blood meant the men, that a wife who came in from outside was a caretaker of the estate and not an owner of it, and no evidence assembled by God or the state of North Carolina was ever going to move her off that conviction by so much as an inch. She believed it the way other people believe in gravity. That is the thing you have to understand about her. She never once thought she was doing wrong. She thought she was correcting an error. After Wendell passed, I had the farm, our 2 grown children, and a house that ticked and settled around me at night like a living thing getting comfortable. Marguerite, my elder, was 33 then and ran a small equine rehabilitation operation on the back 40, taking in foundered and injured horses and bringing them sound again. My son Douglas was 30 and lived in Cary with his wife and worked in medical billing for a company called Delphi Health and had, I will say plainly, always been closer to his grandmother than to me. Bernadette had raised him 3 summers running while Wendell and I were posted overseas, and she had filled those summers with a version of the family story in which she was the rightful keeper of the land and I was the interloper in the good uniform. I heard the echoes of it for years without recognizing the source, the way you hear a dripping faucet at night and blame the wind. The first wrong note came at Marguerite's wedding, and it came from Bernadette, and I talked myself out of it for over a year. Marguerite married a good, quiet man named Theo in June, in the side yard under the 2 water oaks, with 110 folding chairs I had rented from the Kiwanis, and a caterer out of Wake Forest doing pulled pork and vinegar slaw. The dress was the thing. It had been my mother's, and my mother's mother's before that, a heavy ivory silk from 1946 with 100 covered buttons down the back and a hand-worked lace at the collar that a woman in Charleston had tatted by candlelight in the last year of the war. Marguerite had wanted it since she was 6 years old and used to pull it out of the cedar chest and drape it over the porch rail. We had it fitted twice. The morning of the wedding, it hung in the front guest room in a muslin garment bag, and Bernadette had asked, the night before, if she might be the one to bring it up when it was time to dress, because she had never been given a real part in a wedding, and she wanted to feel useful. I thought that was tender. I told her yes. At 10 that morning, the dress was gone. Not misplaced, gone. The muslin bag hung empty in the closet, still zipped, and the dress inside it had simply ceased to exist in the world for the next 4 hours. Marguerite was in her slip and her grandmother's pearls. My hairdresser's daughter had her hair half pinned, and the dress that 4 generations of women had married in was nowhere in a house I had turned inside out. Bernadette sat in the wing chair by the window with her hands folded and told us, calmly, that she was sure it would turn up, that these things had a way of resolving themselves, that perhaps Marguerite had never truly wanted to wear something so old and heavy, and this was Providence offering her a graceful way out. She said all of this in a voice like a cool hand on a fevered forehead, and I stood in the doorway of that guest room with the empty garment bag in my 2 hands, and I understood, in a flat, quiet way that had nothing to do with proof yet, exactly what had happened. Marguerite got married in a borrowed sundress that a bridesmaid drove 40 minutes to fetch from her own closet. She was radiant, and she cried, and Theo cried, and it was, by every measure that counts, a real and joyful wedding. But I watched my daughter dance her first dance in another woman's clothes, and I watched Bernadette watch it too, with a small, pleased composure that she would have called peace, and I made myself a promise that I did not yet know how to keep. We found the dress 11 days later. It was in the trunk of Bernadette's Buick, folded into a feed sack, with a long rust stain bled across the bodice where it had lain against a can of stored motor oil in the North Carolina June heat. The Charleston lace was torn at the collar in a way that could not be mended. Bernadette said she had no earthly idea how it had gotten there, that someone must have put it in her car, that at her age, things happened around her that she couldn't account for. She said this while looking directly at me with clear, pale eyes, and I want to be precise about the thing I noticed, because I noticed it that day and I noticed it every time after. When Bernadette lied, she pressed the pad of her right thumb hard against the joint of her right forefinger, over and over, as if she were rolling a very small crumb of bread. I had watched her do it across the Thanksgiving table for years without ever knowing what it was. Now I knew. It was the only part of her that ever told the truth. I did not accuse her. I did not even raise my voice. I took the dress and I laid it flat in acid-free tissue, and I put it away, and I began, without quite deciding to keep a record. This is the part where I have to slow down, because the erosion is the part people never believe until they have lived it. It does not happen in one blow. It happens the way water takes a fence post, a little each season, until the day it goes over in the wind and you tell yourself it was the wind. The first thing was the driveway. That autumn, Bernadette began telling people at the auxiliary and at the feed store and at the Hardee's where the old men drank their morning coffee that the farm had really always been hers, held in trust for the family, and that I was living there by her Christian forbearance. It was not true in any respect. Wendell and I had bought the additional 80 acres ourselves in 1992, and the home place had come to Wendell outright from his father in a will probated in 1988, and it had passed to me, his surviving spouse, plain as daylight. But Bernadette repeated her version with such serene consistency that I would run into people at the Piggly Wiggly who looked at me with a kind of gentle pity, as though I were a squatter who didn't know her time was short. I began carrying in the glove box of my truck a copy of the deed and a copy of Wendell's father's will, because I had learned in 31 years that the person holding the document wins the argument, and the person telling the story loses it. And Bernadette was a magnificent teller of stories. The second thing was Douglas. My son started coming out to the farm on Sundays, which would have been a joy, except that he came with a lawyer's letter's worth of questions. Was the estate really settled? Had I considered that grandmother at her age ought to have the security of knowing the land would stay in the bloodline? Did I understand how it looked, a widow holding 140 acres that generations of his family had worked? He did not raise his voice either. He had learned that from her. He would sit at my kitchen table and eat the pound cake I made from my own mother's recipe, the one with the burnt sugar glaze that takes 40 minutes of standing over a pot, and he would tell me gently that people were talking, that I might think about doing the right thing. And I began to understand that Bernadette had spent 30 years building a case in my own son's mind, brick by patient brick, and that I had been overseas moving cots to Bavaria while she did it. The third thing had a name, and her name was Eleanor. Eleanor Pruitt was a widow of about my age who had married into the family sideways, the second wife of Wendell's late cousin, and she had attached herself to Bernadette with the devotion of a woman who has found her lever. Eleanor did the driving and the phone calls and the small errands, and in return, Bernadette had begun, out loud, to speak of leaving Eleanor the good part of what's mine, which everyone in the county understood to mean the farm that was not Bernadette's to leave. Eleanor took to walking my back fence line on Sunday afternoons with a proprietary air, pointing out to whoever was with her which pasture she'd put in soybeans and which she'd sell to the developer who had already, twice, left his card in my mailbox. I would watch her from the kitchen window over the sink where Wendell had died, and I would dry the same plate for a very long time. The fourth thing was the one that told me it had gone from grievance to plan. In February, a full 16 months after the wedding dress, a document appeared. Douglas brought it out on a Sunday, folded in thirds, and set it on the table beside the pound cake, with the air of a man producing a winning card he was almost sorry to play. It was a will. It purported to be the last will and testament of Wendell's father, Amos Norwood, dated 1986, and it left the entire home place, house, barns, the loblolly stand, all 140 acres by its description, not to Wendell at all, but to Bernadette outright, to dispose of as she saw fit. It bore Amos's signature, or something built to resemble it, and it was witnessed by two names I did not recognize, and it was stamped with the seal of a notary public. I want to describe what I felt, because it was not what people expect. I did not feel panic. I felt a great, cold clarity settle over me, the way it used to settle in an operations tent at 2 a.m. when a convoy had gone wrong and everyone was shouting, and I realized that I was the only one in the room who had actually read the movement order. Because I knew that will was a forgery, and I knew it not from feeling, but from fact, and I knew it in a way that no amount of Bernadette's certainty could touch. I knew it because I was the notary. Let me be plain about that, because it is the whole spine of what happened, and I have been circling it. After I retired from the Army in the spring I turned 59, I did not sit down. A woman who has run a distribution network across 3 continents does not take up needlepoint, whatever Bernadette liked to imply. I had taken the notary commission for the state of North Carolina 18 months before Wendell died, because half our neighbors were elderly and had to drive 40 minutes to town to get a signature witnessed, and I had a good table and a steady schedule, and I liked being useful in the plain, unshowy way my husband had loved being useful. And in 1986, Amos Norwood had never signed any such will. Because Amos Norwood's actual last will and testament, the real one, the one that left the home place to his son Wendell, was drafted in 1988, 2 years after the date on the forgery, at a time when I was a young captain and had never notarized a document in my life. The forgery had gotten its own history wrong. It had aged itself into a decade where its story could not stand. But more than that, the real will, the genuine one, had been re-executed and re-notarized in 2019 at Wendell's request after his first heart scare, so that there would be no daylight in the record if anything happened to him. He had asked me to witness it. Not to notarize it. A notary cannot notarize her own family's interest. I knew that much law. But to be present and to keep the certified copy in the fireproof box in my office closet, alongside the deeds and the survey and 30 years of my own careful paper. Wendell, God rest him, had trusted the record the same way I did. He just never told his mother, because he could not imagine she would ever need to be told. So when Douglas set the forgery on my kitchen table beside the pound cake, I did not argue with it. Arguing with a document is how you lose. I said, "Thank you for bringing this to me, Douglas. I'll want my attorney to look at it." And I watched my son's face do something complicated, because he had expected tears or fury and had gotten a receptionist's courtesy instead, and he did not know what to do with it. My attorney was Jody Vann, and I need to tell you about her because she is not a prop in this. Jody and I had known each other since our girls played rec league softball together in the 90s, back when she was a legal aid lawyer working out of a converted dry cleaners, and I was a major with a duffel bag always half-packed. She was 64 now, drove a diesel Mercedes with 300,000 miles on it, kept a rescued red-bone coonhound named Buford in her office, and had a way of reading a document that reminded me of a hawk reading a field. When I brought her the forgery and, beside it, the certified 2019 re-execution of Amos's real will and the original 1988 probate file I had pulled from the county courthouse, she read all three twice without a word, and then she took off her glasses and said, "Opal, they have not just told a lie. They have created a false instrument and put it into the stream of a probate matter. That is a felony in this state. The question is not whether we win. The question is how gently you want to do it, because your son's fingerprints are on the delivery of it." That stopped me, and I want you to know it stopped me, because I had a decision to make that was not about winning. I could hand the whole file to the district attorney and let Bernadette at 83, and possibly Douglas and Eleanor with her, face charges. Or I could find some other way to end it, one that put the truth in front of every person who had looked at me with that gentle pity, without putting my own son in a courtroom in handcuffs. I sat with Jody's coonhound's head on my knee for a long while, and I thought about Wendell whistling at the bird feeder, and I made my choice. I would not stop absorbing it by swinging back with the heaviest thing I owned. I would stop absorbing it by putting the record where everyone could see it, once, in daylight, and letting the record do what records do. Here is the small thing I have never forgotten from the middle of all that. The week I pulled the probate file, the clerk at the Wake County Register of Deeds was a young man named Rashad, maybe 25, with a lanyard full of pins from a community college robotics team. When I told him the year I needed and why my hands were full, he did not make me fill out the form twice or send me to another window. He went back into the old bound volumes himself on his own break, and he found the 1988 probate, and he made me a certified copy and would not take the fee, and he said, quietly, "My grandmother lost her house to her brother-in-law over a piece of paper. I hope yours turns out different." I never saw him again. But I have thought about that young man more times than I can count, standing in the fluorescent light of that office, deciding to be kind to a stranger. It cost him nothing, and I have carried it for years. The turn came a week later, and it came at a livestock auction barn, and I did not stage it there. The barn was where the family already was, and I simply chose not to wait for a better room. The occasion was the annual spring consignment sale at the Ellerby Road Auction Barn southeast of Raleigh, a long tin building with a dirt ring and steel bleachers and the good sharp smell of cattle and sawdust and diesel that I have loved my whole life. Half the county came to it every year. It was where Wendell's father had bought his first bred heifers in 1951, and where our family had run a consignment of Marguerite's rehabilitated horses every spring, sound animals brought back from ruin and sold on to good homes, which was the closest thing to a family tradition we had left. Bernadette always came, in a folding lawn chair set up by the sale ring, receiving the county like a small monarch. Eleanor came to push the chair. Douglas came because his grandmother summoned him. And that year, Bernadette had let it be known that she intended to announce, from her chair, in front of everyone, that the Norwood land was passing to the family's proper keeping at last, meaning to her, meaning through the forgery, meaning to Eleanor after. She meant to do it publicly because she believed publicly was where it would become true. She had spent her whole life understanding that the story told in the barn beats the paper filed in the courthouse. It was the one thing she and I actually agreed on. I had just spent 31 years learning that she was wrong. I brought a manila folder. That was all. Not a lawyer at my elbow, though Jody was there in the third row of the bleachers in her good boots. And not a sheriff, and not a raised voice. I brought the certified copy of the real 1988 will, the 2019 re-execution I had witnessed, and a one-page letter on the letterhead of the notary who had actually performed the 2019 notarization, a woman named Priscilla Boyd out of Lewisburg, who had gone back to her own journal, the bound register every North Carolina notary is required by law to keep, and confirmed in writing the date, the parties, and the thumbprint she had taken that day, because Priscilla, like me, believed in the record. I want to be clear that the strength here was never a hidden card I had been clutching. It was 30 years of the same plain habit, keeping the second copy that anyone could have built, and almost nobody does. When Bernadette rose from her lawn chair between the yearling lots and the auctioneer paused the microphone for her, the way the county always did, and she began in that cool, clear voice to tell 300 people about the family's proper inheritance and the widow who had held it too long, I stood up from the bleachers and I walked down to the rail, and I asked the auctioneer, a decent man named Curtis Meeks, who had known Wendell 40 years, if I might say a word to my family in front of the neighbors, since my mother-in-law had chosen to make it a public matter. Curtis looked at Bernadette, and he looked at me, and he handed me the microphone. I did not make a speech. I have heard enough speeches. I said that a document had been shown to me and to my son, claiming to be my late father-in-law's will, dated 1986, and that I wanted everyone who had heard the story to also see the record, so that no one would have to wonder. And then I read, slowly, the date on the real will, 1988, 2 years after the forgery claimed Amos had signed a different one, at a time the forgery could not explain. I read the notary's letter from Priscilla Boyd confirming the thumbprint. I held up the certified courthouse copy with the Register of Deeds stamp that young Rashad had pressed for me, and I invited anyone who doubted it to drive to the courthouse Monday morning and pull the same file themselves because it was public, and it had been public for 35 years, and all anyone had ever had to do was look. And here is where I have to be honest about Bernadette, because a lesser accounting would have her crumble, and she did not crumble. She did not go pale, and she did not sit down, and she did not then or ever admit that she had done a single wrong thing. She stood at her lawn chair with her chin up and her pearls on, and she pressed the pad of her right thumb against her forefinger, rolling that invisible crumb of bread faster than I had ever seen her do it. And she said, in front of the whole county, that paper could say what it liked, but blood was blood, and everyone present knew the truth of the family, whatever the courthouse claimed. She believed it. That is the terrible, ordinary thing. She stood there, having been shown, in daylight, in front of every person whose good opinion she had spent 83 years cultivating, that she had fabricated a will and ruined a wedding dress and slandered a widow, and she was as certain as she had ever been that she was the one in the right, and the rest of the world had simply failed to keep up. But the county was not looking at her anymore. That was the thing. They were looking at the stamp on the paper in my hand. I watched it move across the bleachers the way I used to watch a rumor move through a company mess, face to face, a settling and a turning. Eleanor Pruitt, who had walked my fence line planting her soybeans, got up quietly and went out to her car and did not come back. And I never once heard her mention the good part of What's Bernadette's again. And Douglas? My son Douglas stood at the rail with his grandmother's forgery still, I imagine, folded somewhere in his truck, and he looked at that 1988 date, and I watched him do the arithmetic his grandmother had counted on him never doing. He is in medical billing. He reconciles dates and records for a living. He knew what a 2-year gap meant. And something went out of his face that had been put there 30 years before across a summer kitchen table, and it did not come back. A week after Douglas laid the forgery on my table, Bernadette had lost everything she had spent a lifetime accumulating, which was never the land, because the land was never hers. It was the county's belief in her, the auxiliary's deference, the pastor's respect, the unquestioned authority of her version of the story. She lost it not because I destroyed it, but because I set the record beside it and let 300 neighbors compare the two. The forgery, Jody confirmed for me the following month, was quietly withdrawn before it ever reached a courtroom. The lawyer Bernadette had used to draft it, once he understood what the notary's journal and the courthouse date established, wanted nothing further to do with any of it. No one was arrested. I had decided that already, in Jody's office with the coonhound's head on my knee. The truth in daylight had always been enough. It was all I had ever needed, and the only reason it took me 16 months was that I had loved these people and did not want it to be so. I did not go to Bernadette's funeral 11 months later, and I have made my peace with that. But I went to see her once more before she died, in the nursing home outside Wendell's hometown, because Marguerite asked me to, and because I am, whatever else, Wendell's widow, and I try to be the woman he thought I was. Bernadette was smaller by then, and her mind came and went like weather, but she knew me. She looked at me from the bed with those same clear, pale eyes, and she pressed her thumb to her forefinger under the blanket, rolling the invisible crumb, and she told me, gently, the way she told everyone everything, that I had stolen the family land and that God would sort it out in His time. She was serene. She was, to the last, entirely certain, and it no longer had the power to take a single thing from me, because certainty without the record is just a story, and I had spent my whole life learning the difference. I said, "I know you believe that, Bernadette," and I meant it kindly, which surprised us both. Then I picked up my bag, and I turned and walked out into the parking lot, and I did not look back at her. And that was the last time I saw her rolling that little crumb of bread that only she and I ever knew was a lie. What I rebuilt is quiet, and I like it that way. Marguerite's rehabilitation barn took 2 of the back pastures and does well. She and Teo built a small house at the far end of the loblolly stand, and the mare that foaled 2 nights early the morning I sewed her button now has a grown daughter under saddle. Douglas comes out on Sundays again, slowly, the 2 of us finding our way across a table where a forgery once sat, and he brings his own children, and I have started teaching the older one, who is 9 and serious, how to make the pound cake with the burnt sugar glaze that takes 40 minutes over the pot, because someone in the next generation should be able to make it after I am gone. I still hold my notary commission, and I still witness signatures for the elderly neighbors who cannot make the drive to town, and once a month or so, someone sits at my good table and thanks me for keeping the second copy. And I think of Priscilla Boyd in Lewisburg with her bound journal, and of young Rashad who would not take the fee, and of all the plain, unglamorous people who keep the world honest, one dated initial at a time. And the dress. I had it restored, finally, 2 summers after the auction barn, by the same kind of patient hand that had tatted the collar in 1945. A woman in Charleston who could not save the torn lace, but rebuilt it, stitch for stitch from a photograph, and who bleached out the rust of Bernadette's motor oil until you would have to know exactly where to look to find the shadow of it. It hangs now in acid-free tissue in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, 100 covered buttons and all, waiting for Marguerite's serious 9-year-old, who has already, twice, pulled it out and draped it over the porch rail in the April light, exactly as her mother did, exactly as I did, a piece of ivory silk that 4 generations of women have refused to let a single, certain woman take from us. Bernadette believed the story would win. She was wrong. The record won, and the silk survived, and I am the one who kept them both.